The morning Abigail Slater walked into Harold Fenwick's jewelry shop with her wedding ring pinched between two trembling fingers. The dust outside was so thick and golden it looked like the whole town of Cedar Bluff, Texas, was slowly burning away into nothing, and she felt very much the same way about herself. It was the spring of 1878, and the frontier had not been kind to her. The land had taken everything, the good years, the bad years, the harvest that never came, and finally, the man she had loved since she was 19 years old. Thomas Slater had died 8 months prior, thrown from his horse during a flash flood that swept through the lower valley without a moment's warning. He had been trying to save their 2 cattle, and the cattle had survived. Thomas had not. There was a particular cruelty in that which Abigail still could not fully absorb, even now, even as she stood inside the cool, dim shop with its glass cases and its smell of polish and cedar shavings, her ring resting in her open palm like a small, quiet accusation. She was 29 years old. She had 2 children, Henry, who was 7 and already wore worry in the corners of his dark eyes the way grown men wore weathered lines, and Clara, who was 4 and believed entirely that her mother could fix every problem with her hands and her will. Abigail had been working very hard not to disabuse her of that notion, but now the flour barrel was truly empty. The salt pork was gone. She had $2.30 left from what Thomas's brother Earl had sent before he stopped writing altogether, and the roof over the kitchen was beginning to bow inward in a way that made her think it would not survive another summer storm. She had looked at that ring for 3 days before she decided. She had taken it off and put it back on 17 times. She had pressed it against her lips in the dark, while the children slept, and whispered Thomas's name into the metal like she was asking him permission. And in the end she had decided that Thomas, who had been a practical man with a generous heart, would have told her to do it without hesitating. Harold Fenwick was a small, neat man in his late 50s with silver spectacles, and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who understood the weight that objects could carry. He did not look at Abigail the way some of the other men in Cedar Bluff looked at a young widow, with that mixture of pity and opportunism that made her skin go tight. He simply looked at the ring she placed on the glass counter, and then he looked at her face, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of quiet respect. "That is a gold band," he said. "Simple cut. Good quality for what was likely not an extravagant purchase." "It was not," she said. "Thomas saved for 4 months to buy it. He was very proud of that." Fenwick picked it up and turned it toward the light from the window. He examined it with a small glass he produced from his vest pocket, and he was quiet for a long moment. "I can give you $7 for this," he said. $7. Abigail did calculations in her head that she had already done 100 times. $7 would buy flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, a small tin of lard, a pound of coffee, enough candles to last through June, and perhaps a small piece of fabric to patch Henry's trousers before they became entirely unwearable. She could stretch $7 into 6 weeks of survival if she was careful, and Abigail Slater had become very good at being careful. "I will take it," she said, and she was proud of the fact that her voice did not waver. Fenwick set the ring down on a small velvet tray behind the counter. He counted out $7 in coins and paper and slid it across the glass to her. She gathered it up and put it in the small cloth purse she kept in her coat pocket, and she said thank you, and she turned to leave. "Mrs. Slater," he said, and she stopped. She did not turn around right away. She was not sure she trusted her face just then. "I knew Thomas, not well, but I knew him. He traded a set of spurs in here 2 winters ago. Told me they were his father's and he hated to part with them, but the children needed boots." She turned around then. "He never told me that." Fenwick nodded slowly. "I thought perhaps not. He was that kind of man." She walked out into the golden dust and stood on the board sidewalk for a moment with the coins pressing against her palm through the cloth of her purse and the sun hitting her full in the face. And she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of grief before she set her shoulders and walked toward Halpern's general store to spend her husband's wedding ring on beans and flour. It was a week and 4 days later that a stranger rode into Cedar Bluff. He came in from the north, which was unusual, because the northern road through the Comanche Ridge country was rougher and longer than the main trail, and most travelers avoided it unless they knew what they were doing or they were trying not to be seen. This man, however, did not have the look of someone who was hiding. He sat straight in the saddle of a big dark roan gelding, and he wore a brown duster that was dusty at the hem and a hat that had seen considerable weather. And when he rode down Main Street, he did so at an easy walk, not looking at the storefronts or the people on the porches, but looking instead at the land itself. The dry creek bed at the edge of town, the way the wind moved through the little cluster of cottonwood trees by the livery, the angle of the sun against the bluff that gave the town its name. His name was Jeremiah Wells. He was 32 years old. He had spent the last 4 years working cattle drives up through Kansas and doing whatever work presented itself in the intervals: fence building, tracking, occasional scouting for the Army, which he had quit when it became clear that the Army's work in that part of Texas was not work he could continue to do with a clean conscience, given what was being done to the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had lived there long before any of them. He had a particular moral seriousness about him that sometimes made people uncomfortable, because it was not the kind of morality that announced itself with scripture and judgment, but rather the quieter, harder kind that simply refused to do things it knew to be wrong. He had come to Cedar Bluff at the request of a letter. The letter was folded in the breast pocket of his shirt, tucked against the left side of his chest, and it had been written by Harold Fenwick, who was Jeremiah's mother's older brother, which made Fenwick his great-uncle by blood, though they had met only twice in Jeremiah's life. The first time, Jeremiah had been 12 years old and Fenwick had given him a peppermint stick. The second time, Jeremiah had been 26 and Fenwick had loaned him $40 without being asked and told him to pay it back when he was able and not before. Jeremiah had paid it back 18 months later, every cent, plus interest that Fenwick refused to accept, but Jeremiah had left on the counter anyway before walking out the door. The letter had found him in Amarillo, through a chain of forwarding addresses that had taken 3 weeks to reach him, and it read as follows: Dear Jeremiah, I am writing to ask a favor of you, though I understand it is a considerable one, and you are under no obligation to oblige me. Some weeks ago, a young woman named Abigail Slater came into my shop and sold me her wedding ring for $7 so that she could feed her 2 children. Her husband Thomas died last autumn and left her with a small piece of land, a leaking roof, and very little else. She is a woman of notable character and considerable pride, and the fact that she came to me at all tells you something about the severity of her situation, because I do not think she came easily. I have been thinking about this transaction in a way that I cannot entirely settle in my conscience. I understand that business is business and that the ring was freely offered and freely purchased, but I have been in this trade long enough to know the difference between something being sold and something being surrendered. Mrs. Slater surrendered that ring. I would like you to return it to her. I am enclosing it with this letter, wrapped in the velvet. I am also enclosing a second letter, addressed to her, which I hope you will deliver along with the ring. I cannot return it myself and explain the reason to her satisfaction. She would refuse it on grounds of pride, and she would be right too with me. But a stranger, a man with no history and no debt between them, might be able to press the matter through before she can fully organize her refusal. Beyond the errand, I will say this: Cedar Bluff has good land north of the creek if you have any interest in staying somewhere. The town could use a man who knows how to do things. There are worse places. Your affectionate relation, Harold Fenwick. Jeremiah had read the letter 3 times in the single-candle lantern of his rented room in Amarillo, with the ring resting on the bedside table catching what little light there was. It was a simple band, worn smooth on the inside from years of wear. It was not worth thinking hard about as a piece of jewelry. As a piece of someone's life, it was considerable. He had not planned on going to Cedar Bluff. He had not planned on going anywhere in particular, which had been true for longer than was comfortable to admit. But something in the letter and something in the object made the decision feel less like a choice and more like a direction he had already been walking in without knowing it. He packed his things the next morning and rode south. He found Harold Fenwick's shop without difficulty. Fenwick was exactly as Jeremiah remembered him: small, precise, and with eyes that took in more than they gave back. They shook hands and Fenwick made coffee on the small iron stove in the back room, and they talked for an hour, the way two men who do not know each other well but share a kind of temperament sometimes can, easily and without pretense. "She is going to resist," Fenwick said. "I want you to understand that. Abigail Slater is not a woman who accepts things without understanding the terms, and she does not like the feeling of being helped as though she is helpless." "I understand," Jeremiah said. "No, you do not yet," Fenwick said, with a patience that was entirely without condescension. "She is going to make arguments, good ones. She will say it is charity, and she will say she does not accept charity, and she will mean it. You will need to have a better argument, or at least a more persistent one." "What does the letter say? The one you wrote for her?" Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "It says the truth, that I have been in the jewelry business for 30 years, and I have bought things from people in hard circumstances before, and sometimes I have regretted it. That the ring was sold to me under conditions of necessity rather than genuine willingness, and that it was worth more to her than it was to me, and that I would rather sleep easily than hold onto something I obtained through someone's desperation. It says none of it is charity. It says it is a correction of a transaction that was not quite right." Jeremiah thought about that. "Is that actually how you feel?" "It is the most accurate thing I know how to say," Fenwick said. The next morning, Jeremiah Wells rode out of Cedar Bluff and north along the dry creek bed toward the small homestead that Fenwick had described, with the ring in his breast pocket alongside Fenwick's letter, and the roan gelding moving at a steady walk through the pale morning light. The Slater homestead was about 2 miles from town. Jeremiah could see it from a distance: a modest wood frame house with a covered porch that needed repair, a small barn that was in reasonable condition, a kitchen garden that was clearly being tended with attention, if not always with the resources it needed. There were 3 chickens in the yard. There was a boy sitting on the porch steps whittling something with a small knife, who looked up with sharp dark eyes that evaluated Jeremiah with a thoroughness that would have been impressive in a man twice his age. "Morning," Jeremiah said, pulling the roan to a stop a respectful distance from the porch. "Is your mother home?" "She is," the boy said, and did not elaborate. Jeremiah waited. The boy waited. They regarded each other. "Might I speak with her?" Jeremiah said. "Depends on what about," the boy said. Despite himself, Jeremiah felt the corner of his mouth move. "I have something to return to her, from Harold Fenwick's shop in town." Something shifted in the boy's eyes, a small flash of something that was not quite suspicion but not quite welcome either. He set down his whittling and went inside, and Jeremiah heard the low murmur of voices from within the house, and then footsteps, and then Abigail Slater came through the front door and stood on the porch. She was not what he had expected, though he had not exactly formed an expectation. She was of medium height, with dark brown hair pinned up in a practical way that had several pieces escaped from it in the morning wind. She was wearing a plain cotton dress and a canvas work apron, and she had the kind of face that was handsome in an unself-conscious way: strong jaw, clear gray eyes that were presently regarding him with a very careful attention, a mouth that looked like it was in the habit of making decisions. She had flour on her left forearm, and she did not appear to notice or care about this. She was clearly someone who was in the middle of doing something and had come out to deal with this interruption before returning to it. "You are from Mr. Fenwick's shop," she said. "Not exactly," Jeremiah said. He dismounted and looped the roan's reins over the porch rail without asking permission, because he sensed that asking permission for a small thing would cost him credibility he might need for the larger thing. "My name is Jeremiah Wells. Harold Fenwick is my great-uncle by blood. He wrote and asked me to bring you something." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the small square of velvet, folded, and held it out toward her. "And to deliver a letter." She did not move toward him immediately. Her eyes went from the velvet square to his face, and he understood that she was calculating who he was, what this meant, whether it was something she was going to have to refuse. "What is inside that cloth?" she said, though he suspected she already knew. "Your ring," he said, "the one you sold to Mr. Fenwick." Something moved across her face very quickly and then was gone, replaced by something that was careful and controlled. "I sold that ring," she said. "It is no longer my property." "Mr. Fenwick disagrees," Jeremiah said. He held the velvet out with a steadiness he did not entirely feel, because something about the way she held herself, the absolute refusal to break under what he could tell was considerable emotion, was doing something unexpected to his chest. "He wrote you a letter explaining his reasoning. He asked that you read it before you decide." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she said, "I will read the letter." And she took the velvet square and the envelope that Jeremiah produced from his coat pocket, and she went inside. She did not invite him in. He had not expected her to. He stood in the yard in the morning sun and listened to the chickens and waited. Henry came back to the porch steps and picked up his whittling again. The younger child, the little girl, appeared in the doorway and looked at Jeremiah with an open, unguarded curiosity that was the precise opposite of her brother's watchfulness. "That is a very large horse," she said. "His name is Copper," Jeremiah said. "He is fairly gentle if you want to see him up close." The little girl looked at her brother. Her brother looked at Jeremiah with an evaluation that was frankly judicial. "She can see him from there," Henry said. "Fair enough," Jeremiah said, and he waited. It was 10 minutes before Abigail came back out. She had the letter in one hand and the velvet square in the other, the square still folded, and her face was very carefully composed in the way of someone who has been managing their expression deliberately for long enough that it had become a kind of armor. "Mr. Fenwick writes very kindly," she said. "He means it," Jeremiah said. "I have no doubt that he does." She looked down at the velvet in her hand. "He says this is not charity. He believes that. Do you?" She looked up at him, and her gray eyes were direct in a way that took him off guard, not aggressive, but genuinely inquiring, as though his opinion on the matter was something that carried weight with her, though they had never met before this morning. Jeremiah thought about the question honestly, the way he thought about most things. "I think charity is when you give someone something they have no claim to," he said slowly. "I think what he is doing is returning something you had a claim to, that circumstances forced you to surrender. That is different." She considered this. "That is a useful distinction," she said at last, and something in her voice had shifted, not warmly, not yet, but the closed quality had opened the smallest amount, like a window unlatched but not yet pushed. "I understand if you want to return it anyway," he said. "I do not think less of you either way. But Mr. Fenwick asked me to press the matter before you made a final decision, so I am pressing it." She looked at the velvet square for a long moment. Then she unfolded it. The ring rested in the small hollow of cloth, and she looked at it, and Jeremiah saw her throat move. The little girl had come down from the porch and was standing next to her mother's knee looking up at the ring with round eyes. "Is that Papa's ring?" Clara said. "It is Mama's ring," Abigail said quietly. "It has always been Mama's ring." She folded her fingers around it, and she slipped it back onto her left hand, and she stood there for a moment in the morning light with her eyes very bright, and Jeremiah looked away because the moment seemed entirely private. "Tell Mr. Fenwick I am grateful," she said, when she had her voice back, "and tell him I will find a way to repay him when I am able." "I think he would tell you the account is settled," Jeremiah said. "That is what he would say," she agreed, "but I would rather not leave accounts open." Jeremiah nodded. He untied the roan's reins from the porch rail and put his foot in the stirrup. "Good day, Mrs. Slater." "Good day, Mr. Wells," she said. And then, as he was settling into the saddle, she said, "How long are you planning to stay in Cedar Bluff?" He looked down at her. Her expression was still careful, but the question was genuine, and they both understood that it was something more than a social inquiry. It was the kind of question asked by a person who is beginning to calculate whether a stranger might become a known quantity. "I am not certain," he said honestly. "Perhaps a while." He rode back toward town. He did not intend to become involved in the life of Abigail Slater. He told himself this with a clarity that should have been more convincing than it was. He found the work that Fenwick had mentioned. The north property needed fencing, and a rancher named Calhoun needed an extra hand for spring roundup. And both of these things occupied his days in a way that was satisfying, physical, and largely kept him from thinking too much about clear gray eyes and a woman standing in morning light, folding her fingers around something she had thought she had lost. He saw her again 3 days later at Halpern's general store. She was buying cornmeal and a small piece of blue calico, and she had the little girl with her, and the little girl saw Jeremiah before Abigail did, and announced this fact with a volume and enthusiasm that made 2 of the other women in the store turn to look. "That is the man with the horse named Copper," Clara said. Abigail turned, and something passed across her face so quickly that Jeremiah only caught the edge of it before it was composed away. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wells." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Slater. Miss Clara," he said with a nod to the little girl who beamed. "You remembered my name," Clara said. "Your mother mentioned it," he said. He was buying coffee and a package of nails and a new pair of work gloves, and they ended up at the same end of the counter at the same time, waiting for Mr. Halpern to come back from the stockroom. And there was a conversation that was easy in the way that conversations sometimes are when 2 people have already been honest with each other about something that mattered. She asked where he was from, and he told her southern Missouri, the hill country, a farm that his father had worked and that he had left at 17 because he and his father had fundamentally different opinions about several things, not all of which had ever been resolved before his father died. She asked whether he had family elsewhere, and he said an aunt in Kansas City he wrote to sometimes in Fenwick, whom he saw rarely. He did not ask her questions because he did not want her to feel examined, but she offered some things anyway, that she and Thomas had come to Cedar Bluff from Arkansas when Henry was 2 years old, because Thomas had believed in the land there, in the grass and the water rights and the possibility, and that he had not been entirely wrong about any of it. The land was good. The problem had simply been timing and luck and a flash flood on a dark October night. He would have made it work, she said, and it was not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of clear-eyed reckoning with a fact that remained hard even after 8 months. He was that kind of man. He did not stop at things. "That is a good quality," Jeremiah said. "It was," she said simply. Clara was pulling on her mother's skirt to show her something in the glass case by the door, and Abigail excused herself and moved away, and Jeremiah was left with the particular feeling of someone who has had a door open a crack and then watched it gently close again. Not shut, just close, as though the room inside needed a little more warmth before visitors could be admitted. He thought about her more than he wanted to for the next several days. He was not a man who had spent much time in the company of women. There had been a girl named Ruth in Missouri when he was 20, and they had had an understanding for about a year before it became clear that what he wanted and what she wanted were not the same geography, quite literally. She had wanted to stay, and he had needed to go, and neither of them had been wrong. They had simply been incompatible in a specific and irresolvable way. There had been other brief and inconclusive things since then, the kinds of connections that happen to men who are always moving through places rather than living in them. He was 32 years old, and he had lived more or less like water, finding its own level going where the landscape directed him, settling temporarily into depressions and basins, moving on when the grade changed. He had not, before this point, felt strongly that this was a problem. He was, therefore, somewhat alarmed to find himself riding past the north road that led toward the Slater homestead on a Saturday morning, with a bag of freshly bought groceries on his saddle. telling himself he had no particular plan, when it was entirely clear that he had a particular plan and was simply too cautious to admit it to himself. He stopped Copper at the junction and sat there for a moment in the early heat. Then he turned north. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, which meant she saw him coming from some distance, and she straightened up and watched him ride in with the expression of a woman who is making rapid calculations and arriving at an answer she is not entirely ready to act upon. She had a wide-brimmed straw hat on against the sun, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was garden dirt on her hands, and she looked, he thought, entirely herself in a way that was somehow striking. "Mr. Wells," she said. "Mrs. Slater," he said. "I was in Halpern's this morning, and I noticed they had fresh peaches come in on the supply wagon from San Antonio. I bought too many. I was wondering if you might help me with the surplus." He held up the cloth bag, which did contain peaches, 6 of them, along with coffee and a half-pound of sugar that he had added because peaches went well with sugar, and also because it had been clear in the store that she had counted coins very carefully before buying her last small tin. She looked at the bag and then at him, and he could see her organizing her pride into position, getting ready to refuse, and so he added, "Henry and Clara might like them. Peaches are a rare thing out here before summer's fully on." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is a manipulation, Mr. Wells." "It is," he agreed pleasantly. "Is it working?" There was a pause that stretched out in the warm morning air, and then Abigail Slater did something he had not yet seen her do. She smiled. It was not a wide smile. It was brief and slightly reluctant, but it reached her gray eyes and changed the whole geometry of her face, and Jeremiah felt something in his chest shift with a finality that was, on reflection, both alarming and clarifying. "Come in for coffee," she said. "Henry has gone with the Rawlings boy to look at a litter of new pups, and Clara is napping, so it will be quiet for once." He left Copper at the hitching post and followed her into the house. The interior was modest but carefully arranged. Every piece of furniture had a purpose. Everything was clean. There was a sampler on the wall above the fireplace that read "Home is where love stays" in cross-stitch that looked old enough to have been made by someone else's hands, perhaps a grandmother's. There were 2 small pairs of boots by the door, arranged with a neatness that suggested a mother who had taught her children to value order. There was a stack of mending on the chair by the window, and a dog-eared Bible on the mantel, and a child's drawing pinned near the door that appeared to be a horse but might have been several other things. He sat at the kitchen table while she made coffee on the cast-iron stove, and they talked in the easy way that they were beginning to establish. Not easy because everything was simple between them, but easy in the way of 2 people who have discovered they can be direct with each other without it becoming difficult. He asked about the land, the north fields, the water from the well, the state of the barn roof that he had noticed was missing 2 shingles. She answered these questions with the practicality of someone who had been thinking hard about all of them. They were not small talk. They were the conversation of 2 people feeling out whether their minds moved in compatible directions. "Thomas put those shingles on the season before he died," she said, setting a tin mug of coffee in front of him. "He said they would last 10 years. They lasted 2. She said it without bitterness, with a kind of fond exasperation that suggested she had told this story to herself as a way of keeping him alive in her daily thoughts. "If you have spare shingles," Jeremiah said carefully, "I could fix those." She sat down across from him with her own coffee and looked at him steadily. "You have fencing work on the north property and roundup work with Calhoun, and apparently enough time left over to be running errands for your gray tuncle and showing up at my homestead with peaches." "I am an efficient worker," he said. "Mr. Wells," she said, and there was something in the way she said his name that was part amusement and part something else, something that might have been the beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. "Are you trying to be useful to me?" He thought about whether to answer this with a deflection and decided against it. "Yes," he said. She considered this with the same careful attention she seemed to give everything. "Why?" He looked at his coffee cup. "Because you are in a difficult situation through no fault of your own," he said, "and because I appear to have time and ability that could address some of the practical problems around this property, and because—" He stopped. "Because," she said quietly. "Because I find myself wanting to," he said, and looked up at her, and they held each other's gaze for a moment that was not nothing. She looked away first. "You should know," she said, her voice very even, "that I am not looking for a replacement husband. I am looking for a way to survive the next year with my children and my land intact." "I know that," he said, "and I am not a woman who is easy to—" She paused, choosing her word. "To know, I have been told this." "By whom?" "Thomas, mostly." And there was that brief reluctant smile again, the one that changed her face. "He said I was about as yielding as the bluff stone." He said it affectionately. "It sounds like he understood you," Jeremiah said. "He did," she said. "It took him 3 years of trying." "I am a patient man," Jeremiah said quietly. She looked at him again, and this time the look held a long moment, and something in it was both a warning and an acknowledgement. A warning that she meant everything she had said, and an acknowledgement that she had heard what he had not quite said. "The shingles are in the barn," she said at last. "Left side, stacked against the south wall." He fixed the roof that afternoon while she worked in the garden below, and they did not talk much. But the silence between them was comfortable in the way of people who do not need to fill space with noise. Henry came home from the Rawlings place and looked at the man on the roof with a suspicion that was not hostile but was clearly defensive on his mother's behalf. And Jeremiah came down the ladder and shook the boy's hand formally and said, "Your mother said you are good with a knife. That whittling you were doing when I first came, what was it going to be?" Henry blinked, surprised to be asked directly and about something he cared about. "A horse," he said after a moment. "Though it does not look much like one yet." "Can I see it?" Henry retrieved it and handed it over with the cautious pride of someone showing something unfinished. Jeremiah turned it over in his hands with genuine attention. "You have the head right," he said. "The neck is where it goes wrong. Horses have more arch in the neck than people think. See how Copper is standing over there. Look at the line from his ears down to his shoulder. That is the line you want." Henry looked at Copper for a long moment with focused, serious attention. Then he took the piece of wood back and looked at it differently. Clara came running from the house and attached herself to Jeremiah's leg with an enthusiasm that made Abigail call from the garden to not bother the man. And Jeremiah said she was no bother. And Clara showed him a rock she had found that she believed was a kind of treasure. And he examined it with the seriousness it deserved and agreed that it was an unusually fine rock. He stayed for supper. He had not planned to stay for supper. He was not entirely sure how it happened, except that Abigail said the beans were almost ready and there was plenty, and he did not refuse quickly enough. And then Henry set an extra place at the table with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had decided to give something a chance, and so he stayed. The meal was simple beans and cornbread and the last of a jar of preserved plums, and it was one of the best meals he had eaten in longer than he could immediately calculate, not because of the food, which was good enough but not extraordinary, but because of the table. The way Clara announced 4 completely separate things simultaneously, and neither her mother nor her brother seemed to think this was unusual. The way Henry asked him about cattle drives with a careful casualness that was entirely transparent in its genuine curiosity. The way Abigail refilled his coffee without asking and caught his eye for a half-second when she set the cup back down. A brief, warm flash of something that was acknowledgement of the fact that this was happening, whatever this was, that it was happening between them, and she was not entirely displeased about it, even though she was clearly still deciding how she felt. He rode back to town in the last of the evening light, feeling like a man who has been traveling for years and has unexpectedly come to a place that might be worth stopping. The weeks that followed were a kind of courtship that neither of them named aloud, because naming it would have required both of them to make decisions they were not yet ready to have made. But it was a courtship nonetheless, conducted in the currency of practical help and honest conversation, and the slow accumulation of small moments that individually meant little and collectively meant everything. He fixed the porch rail that had come loose. He helped her dig a deeper irrigation channel from the creek to the kitchen garden. He spent 2 full days with Henry plowing the north field, which Abigail had not been able to plant last season because she could not manage both the plow and the horse, and Henry had not been strong enough yet to do it alone. They planted winter wheat in the turned earth together, the 3 of them, and Clara sat at the field's edge and watched them and occasionally brought them water in a tin cup with the gravity of someone fulfilling an important commission. He and Abigail talked. They talked in the long evenings on the porch when the children were inside, sitting in the 2 chairs that faced the western sky as it moved through its extraordinary colors toward dark. They talked about the land and the country and the way the West was changing, the railroads pushing further into the frontier, the cattle towns growing and then changing as the drives diminished, the trouble between the settlers and the people who had been there before all of them, which was a subject on which Jeremiah had strong and complicated feelings that he expressed with a directness that surprised her at first and then interested her deeply. "You were scouting for the army," she said one evening, when he had been talking about the Comanche country north of Cedar Bluff. "And you quit." "I did," he said, "because of what they were doing." "Because of what we were doing," he said. "I was part of it for long enough to know that what I was contributing to was not something I could continue to contribute to in good conscience. The people who had been living in that country for generations were being systematically dispossessed. There is not a polite word for it. I understand why settlers came here. I understand necessity and hunger and the land hunger that drives a family west. But understanding something does not mean the thing being done is right." She was quiet for a while. "Thomas thought about that," she said. "He thought about whether our being here was at someone else's expense. He did not know what to do with that thought." "Most people do not," Jeremiah said. "Including me, I live here too. I am not exempt from the thing I am describing." "No," she said thoughtfully, "but you have not stopped looking at it. That is something." He looked at her profile against the fading sky, and he thought that she was one of the most interesting people he had ever talked to, and that this had crept up on him sideways while he was being useful with fence rails and roof shingles, and that he was now, quite clearly, in a great deal of trouble in the best possible sense. "Abigail," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it. She turned and looked at him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to take it seriously and not answer it quickly." "All right," she said very quietly. "I would like to continue spending time here," he said, "not as a neighbor doing odd jobs. As someone who is," he searched for the right words, the words that were honest but not presumptuous, that said what he meant without saying more than he had the right to say yet. "As someone who is interested in you, in this family, in what is here." He stopped and waited. She did not answer quickly. He had asked her not to, and she honored that. She looked at the dark sky and the first stars coming through, and he could see the thoughts moving behind her face, the careful deliberation, the weighing, the same thorough evaluation she brought to everything. "I have 2 children," she said at last. "They are not a small thing. They are not something that can be peripheral to whatever this might be. Henry already lost his father. Clara was so young she barely knows what she lost, and that is in some ways harder, not easier. If someone were to come into their lives and then leave, I understand," he said, and he meant it completely. "Do you?" She turned and looked at him with eyes that were searching for evasion and finding none. "Because that is not a theoretical concern for me. That is the most important thing I have." "It is not theoretical for me either," he said. "I am not asking to step into their lives lightly. I am not a man who enters things lightly. I spent 4 years moving because I could not find a reason to stop. I have found a reason to stop." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said, "I am not going to make any promises yet. "I am not asking for any yet," he said. "But I am not going to ask you to stay away," she said. "I want you to know that. I am not asking you to stay away." He nodded. And because he was the kind of man who knew when a conversation had reached its natural end, and did not push past it, he said good night and rode back to Cedar Bluff. And he lay in his rented room above the livery stable and looked at the ceiling and felt something that he identified, with the honesty he applied to everything, as hope. Cedar Bluff had a church that held services on Sunday mornings, and it also had a preacher named Reverend Hobart who was well-meaning and somewhat long-winded, and who had taken to greeting Jeremiah after services with pointed looks in the direction of the Slater family pew, which was either a form of community encouragement or a form of pastoral meddling, possibly both. Jeremiah bore this with good humor. He had been welcomed into Cedar Bluff's life more easily than he expected, which he attributed partly to his willingness to do whatever work was needed, and partly to the fact that Fenwick had been there 30 years and people trusted Fenwick, and Fenwick trusted Jeremiah, and trust in small frontier towns moved in those kinds of chains. He had a particular friendship developing with a man named Bart Hogan, who ran the livery and had been in Cedar Bluff since before there was properly a Cedar Bluff, and who knew everything about everyone with the benign, unsurprised interest of a man who has watched 3 generations of human behavior and concluded that people are mostly predictable but occasionally wonderful. "She is a fine woman," Bart said one morning without preamble while Jeremiah was brushing Copper down in the livery stable. "Who is?" Jeremiah said, which was not his best work. "You know who," Bart said equably. "Thomas Slater was a friend of mine. Good man." This land took him the way it takes good men sometimes, because it is not fair and it never has been. Abigail has been out there alone for 8 months, being about 3 times as capable as anyone in this town has given her credit for. He paused. "She needs someone who sees that, not someone who pities it." "I know the difference," Jeremiah said. "I expect you do," Bart said. "That is why I am telling you and not warning you." Jeremiah thought about that for a while. There was a moment in July, about 8 weeks after Jeremiah had first ridden out to the homestead, that was not dramatic or declarative, but that he would return to in his memory many times afterward as the moment when he understood with complete certainty what he was feeling and stopped having any ambivalence about it. It was a hot afternoon. He had been helping her haul water from the creek to the garden because the well was running low, which was a concern she was managing with the steady pragmatism she applied to every crisis, assessing it, making a plan, executing the plan. They had been working for 2 hours, carrying buckets in the heat that was brutal even in the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek, and Henry had been helping too, and Clara had been trying to help in the way that 4-year-olds help, which was enthusiastic and occasionally obstructive. They had stopped to rest in the shade, all 4 of them, and Abigail had passed the water jug around and sat down on the ground against a cottonwood trunk, with her hat pushed back from her face and her cheeks flushed with heat, and she was watching Clara trying to catch a frog at the edge of the creek with her boots off and her dress hiked up, and she was laughing. It was not the brief and carefully rationed smile he had seen before. It was a full laugh, low and warm and entirely unguarded, at something Clara had said about the frog having an unfriendly face, and it lit her from the inside in a way that Jeremiah felt physically in the center of his chest, a warmth that was not the heat of the July afternoon. Henry was watching him watch his mother, and when Jeremiah became aware of this and looked over, Henry was looking away, turning a piece of grass between his fingers, but there was something in the set of the boy's jaw that was not rejection and not invitation, but was perhaps the beginning of a slow, careful consent. He asked Abigail if he could take Henry into town the following Saturday to look at the new saddles that had come in at the hardware store, not to buy one, just to look, because Henry had mentioned wanting to learn more about tack and Jeremiah knew things about it. She had looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at Henry, who had gone very still with a wanting he was trying not to show, and she said yes. They spent the whole Saturday in town, looking at tack, and then looking at the horses that a trader had brought through, and then eating at the small diner run by Mrs. Cole, where the apple pie was notable. Henry asked Jeremiah approximately 40 questions about cattle and horses and trail life, and the geography of the country to the north and west, and Jeremiah answered all of them with the directness and completeness that the boy clearly appreciated, because he was a boy who wanted information rather than patronizing simplification. On the way home, riding together in the long evening light, Henry said without preamble, "My mother is different when you are around." Jeremiah considered how to respond to this. Different how? Less. Henry thought about it with the careful, deliberate precision that was so like his mother's, less like she is holding something up, like she put some of it down. Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing from where you are standing?" Henry was quiet too. They rode a while in the dry, golden dust of the road. "She worked very hard after Pa died," Henry said. "She did not cry where we could see, but I heard her sometimes. She thought we were asleep." He said this without accusation, just as a fact. "She needs to not have to do everything by herself." "She does," Jeremiah agreed. "She will not let you do too much at once," Henry said. "She is not built that way. I know. You have to be patient." "I am patient," Jeremiah said. Henry looked at him sidelong. "She told Clara that you are one of the honest ones," he said. "I heard them talking. Clara asked what that meant, and Ma said it means he does not pretend to be more or less than what he is." Jeremiah absorbed this. "What did you think of that?" he said. Henry looked straight ahead at the road. "I think she is right," he said, in the tone of someone making a definitive ruling. And then he said no more about it, and they rode the rest of the way in a silence that felt to Jeremiah like something had been given that could not be taken back, and he held it very carefully. He asked her to supper in town the 3rd week of August. He did it while they were working, because she was easier in some ways when there was a task at hand, when a thing was one item in a day's list rather than a grand gesture requiring full attention. He said he had heard that Mrs. Cole's diner had a new cook on Fridays, and the food was supposed to be good, and he would be honored if she would have supper with him, and that Bart Hogan's wife had already offered to mind the children for the evening, because Jeremiah had mentioned the idea to Bart, and Bart, with characteristic efficiency, had handled that part without being asked. She looked at him with that expression that was becoming familiar to him, part exasperation at being outmaneuvered, part affection that she was not quite ready to call by name. "You are very organized about this," she said. "I am a thorough man," he said. "So I am noticing," she said, and there it was again, the smile that changed everything. She said yes. She wore the blue calico dress he had seen her buy the day they spoke in Halpern's store, made up now, and she had done her hair differently, still practical but with a care to it, a few soft pieces framing her face, and when she came to the door of the homestead that Friday evening and he saw her, his hat was in his hands without him being aware of having removed it. "You look beautiful," he said, and it came out with a simplicity that was more sincere than any more elaborate thing would have been. She looked at him steadily. "Thank you," she said, with an equal simplicity, and her chin was up in the way that said she had decided to accept the compliment without deflecting it, which felt to him like a kind of courage. They had supper at Mrs. Cole's diner. The new cook was good beef stew that had been slow-cooked with onions and tomatoes, cornbread that was golden and warm, a peach cobbler that was almost as good as the memory of those first 6 peaches he had brought to her door. They talked about everything and nothing, the town, the land, a funny story he had from the cattle drive about a man named Patterson who was afraid of thunder and had to be talked down off a roof during a storm in Kansas, a story she had about Henry at age 5 trying to teach Clara to count using chickens and the resulting chaos. They laughed together, genuinely and freely, and Jeremiah noticed that she laughed with her whole face and that there was nothing performed about it. But there were also the real conversations, The ones that ran underneath, the easy ones like a deeper current. She talked about what she wanted for the children, Henry's sharp, organized mind, which she thought deserved education beyond what the small one-room schoolhouse in Cedar Bluff could provide. Clara's enormous, sprawling emotional life, which needed to be carefully tended and not clamped down into something more manageable. She talked about the land with a love for it that had obviously grown from Thomas's love, but had now become entirely her own. The way the bluff turned red at sunset, the particular quality of the soil in the north field, the creek in spring when it ran full, and the cottonwoods were putting out new leaves. "I am not leaving this land," she said at one point, and it was not said as a warning to him but as a statement of the deepest kind of fact, the kind that comes from a place in a person that is not negotiable. "Whatever happens, whatever else, I am not leaving this land. It is Henry's and Clara's." "I would not ask you to," he said. She looked at him across the small table. The kerosene lamp between them cast a warm light, and she was very close and very present in a way that he was entirely aware of. "You have been moving a long time," she said. "Are you certain that you want to stop?" "I have been certain of very few things in my life," he said honestly. "I am certain of this." She looked down at her coffee cup and then back up at him. "I am afraid," she said very quietly. "I want you to know that I am not afraid of you, and I am not afraid of this exactly. I am afraid of needing something and losing it. I have lost a great deal already. There is only so much more that a person can absorb and stay whole." "I know," he said, and then carefully, "I cannot promise you that nothing will ever be lost. Nobody can promise that. But I can promise you what kind of man I am. You already know most of it." She nodded slowly. "I do," she said. "Abigail," he said, and something in his voice made her look up and hold his gaze. "I am in love with you. I want you to know that plainly. I'm not asking you anything right now. I know where we are and I know your pace, and I am not going to push it. But I want you to know it because you deserve to know what you are dealing with." The lamp flickered between them. Outside, the sound of the town going about its evening boots on the boardwalk, a horse somewhere, the distant string of a guitar from the saloon 2 streets over. And at their small table, a silence that was not empty but was full, holding something between them that was delicate and present and real. "I know," she said at last. And she did not say it back, not yet, but the way she said it, the directness, the warmth, the way her fingers moved an inch across the table toward his without quite reaching, told him that what she knew was not one thing but several, and that all of them were pointing in the same direction. They walked back through town in the warm night, and she took his arm at the step down from the boardwalk, and did not release it for the 2 blocks to the livery, where he had left the buggy he had borrowed from Bart for the evening. And that was everything, and it was enough. He had been at the Calhoun Ranch all week in September, helping with the fall cattle work, when he got back to Cedar Bluff to find Bart Hogan waiting for him with the look of a man who has news that is both urgent and unwelcome. "What is it?" Jeremiah said before he had fully dismounted. "The Slater place has a problem," Bart said. "There is a man by the name of Dewhurst, Cornelius Dewhurst. He has been buying up land on both sides of the creek for the past year. He has money from somewhere back east, and he has been using it to purchase properties from people who are struggling. He holds the note on 2 farms east of the Slater place already, and he has been making inquiries about Abigail's land." Jeremiah was very still. "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that come through a lawyer," Bart said. "Fellow named Crane from Abilene. He came through 2 days ago and went out to see Abigail. He told her that Dewhurst was willing to buy the Slater property for a fair price, which I am sure is fair only by Dewhurst's accounting. She told him she was not interested in selling, and he told her that might change when winter made itself felt." There was a particular kind of cold anger that Jeremiah knew in himself, not hot, not reckless, but very still and very clear. He handed Copper's reins to Bart and said, "Where is Dewhurst?" "Cedar Bluff Hotel," Bart said. "But Jeremiah, I am not going to do anything foolish," Jeremiah said. "I am going to talk to Abigail first." He went to the homestead. She was in the kitchen when he arrived, the children not yet home from school, and she was sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of her, and an expression on her face that was the absolute iron composure of a woman who has decided to handle something herself and is working out the mechanics of it. "You heard," she said when he came in. "Bart told me." "I handled it," she said. "I told the lawyer I was not interested, and I told him to tell Mr. Dewhurst the same." "I know," he said, sitting down across from her. "What is the piece of paper?" She looked down at it. "I am trying to work out what I owe and what I have and whether I could survive a bad winter without being put in a position where Dewhurst's offer starts to look like a necessity." She said this plainly, without asking for help, just explaining the facts of the situation. "May I look at the numbers?" She hesitated for a moment, that old pride, the old self-sufficiency that was both armor and limitation, and then she turned the paper around and pushed it across the table to him. He went through the numbers carefully. The land held clear title. Thomas had paid it off before he died, which had been a point of great importance to him, and that meant Dewhurst could not use debt to force her hand. The income from the kitchen garden and the 2 cattle she kept was modest. The wheat they had planted was a genuine hope for winter. The roof was now sound, which he had taken care of. The irrigation channel was improved, which meant the garden would do better next summer. "Your position is defensible," he said, looking up. "Not comfortable, but defensible. Dewhurst cannot compel you to sell what is yours. He can make your situation difficult, but he cannot take what is legally yours." "I know that," she said. "I'm not afraid of Dewhurst. I'm afraid of a bad winter and 2 sick children and a barn repair I cannot afford, and all of it at once." She said this with a steadiness that acknowledged the fear without being diminished by it. He looked at her across the table, and he made a decision, and he made it with the deliberateness of a man who does not make decisions quickly but who, once made, holds them absolutely. "Abigail," he said, "I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it out fully before you respond." She folded her hands on the table. "All right. I have $120 saved," he said. "It is not a fortune, but it is real. I have skills and I have the ability to work, and I want to stay here. Not in town, here on this land." He held her gaze. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because of Dewhurst, not because of the winter, not because you need rescuing. I want to be very clear that I understand you do not need rescuing. I am asking because I want to spend the rest of my life in the company of you and your children. Because I love you. Because I have been in love with you since somewhere around the 3rd time you told me you did not accept charity, and I realized I was the luckiest man alive to be near someone with a backbone like yours." She was very still. Her hands on the table did not move. "I am asking you to marry me," he said again, very quietly. "And I am asking you to take all the time you need to decide, because I have told you I am patient, and I meant it." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she looked at the land, with a thoroughness that took in everything, the surface and the depth, the promise and the risk. And then she looked down at her hands on the table, and he saw her take a breath that steadied something. And when she looked back up, her gray eyes were full in a way he had not seen before. Not the bright sharpness of controlled emotion, but something open and real and unheld. "I have been trying very hard," she said, "not to love you." He felt something move through him that was not quite like anything he had words for. "How has that been going?" he said very gently. She made a sound that was half laugh and half something more complicated. "Not well," she said. "Not well at all." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that in the quiet kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window, and it was enough, and it was everything. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Jeremiah Wells." He brought her hand up to his mouth and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, and her fingers tightened on his. And outside a horse went by on the road, and somewhere a door banged in the wind, and the ordinary world continued entirely, without acknowledging that something extraordinary was happening in a modest kitchen in Cedar Bluff, Texas. They told the children that evening when Henry and Clara came in from school, Henry with his satchel and his serious face, and Clara with a dirt smudge on her cheek, and her hair coming out of its braids in the way it always did by noon. Henry looked at Jeremiah and looked at his mother and said, with the careful judicial tone that was so characteristic of him, "Is this what I think it is?" "What do you think it is?" Abigail said. Henry thought for a moment. "You are going to be married," he said. "We are going to be married," she confirmed. Henry looked at Jeremiah for a long moment. Then he stuck out his hand. Jeremiah shook it. The handshake was serious and firm, and said everything that Henry was too careful to say aloud, which was that this was an acceptance, not unconditional, not without a weight of reservation that was entirely understandable and would take time to fully dissolve, but real. A beginning. Clara, who had been vibrating with increasing impatience during this exchange, launched herself at Jeremiah's waist with a force that nearly knocked him sideways and said, "Does that mean you live here now and Copper lives in our barn?" "It does," Jeremiah said, steadying himself and looking down at her with a warmth that he suspected was visible to anyone watching. "Good," Clara said definitively. "I told Mama Copper should live in our barn." Abigail caught Jeremiah's eye over Clara's head, and the smile she gave him was completely unguarded, full and warm, and he thought he would remember it for the rest of his life. There was the matter of Cornelius Dewhurst, which did not go away simply because it was no longer the most urgent thing on Abigail's mind. Jeremiah went to see him 2 days later at the hotel in Cedar Bluff, not with any intention of confrontation, but with the clear intent of making the situation plain. Dewhurst was a heavy-set man from Boston who had come west with capital, and a conviction that the land there was simply waiting to be organized properly by people with the right resources and the right vision. And he had the smooth, patronizing manner of a man who had never in his life had to apologize for wanting too much. Jeremiah sat down across from him in the hotel's small parlor and said, very calmly, that he was going to be marrying Abigail Slater, that the Slater land was not and would never be available for purchase, and that any further visits from lawyers or representatives regarding this matter would be considered harassment of his intended and would be handled accordingly. Dewhurst looked at him with the flat, measuring gaze of a man calculating odds. "And who exactly are you?" he said. "Someone who is going to be farming that land for the next 40 years, Jeremiah said pleasantly. "Good day, Mr. Dewhurst." He left the hotel and did not look back. He heard later from Bart that Dewhurst turned his attention to a different property to the east and was out of Cedar Bluff by October. The problem had not been dramatic to resolve. It had simply required someone standing in the way with enough steadiness that it was not worth the trouble of going around. They were married in October 1878 in the Cedar Bluff Church on a Sunday after the regular service, with Reverend Hobart presiding with a satisfaction that was only barely contained within the boundaries of clerical dignity. The whole town came, or near enough to it. Bart Hogan and his wife, the Rawlings family, Mrs. Cole from the diner, Mr. Halpern from the general store, a dozen ranch families from the surrounding area, and Harold Fenwick, who rode out from town in a suit that was somewhat too warm for the weather and stood in the second pew with the expression of a man watching something unfold that he had some hand in setting in motion and was very pleased about. Abigail wore the blue calico dress again, newly trimmed with white ribbon at the collar and cuffs, and she had a small bunch of the last autumn wildflowers in her hands, dried grass and late yellow blooms, and she looked, to Jeremiah, standing at the front of the church watching her come down the aisle with Henry on one side of her and Clara on the other, like the most beautiful and the most certain thing he had ever seen. He had written the words he wanted to say, and then he had thrown them away because they had not been honest enough. What he said instead was simple and direct and entirely himself, that he promised to be worthy of what she was trusting him with, that he understood the weight of it, that he would work every day to deserve the three people who were now his entire reason for everything, and that he loved her and would love her with whatever steadiness and fullness he possessed for as long as he was alive. She looked at him with clear, bright eyes and said her vows in a strong, even voice, and when she got to the words in sickness and in health, her voice did not waver the way it might have, the way it had perhaps wavered internally when she had first said them to Thomas, because she knew now what those words cost. She said them, and she meant them in a way that was fully grounded in experience rather than hope, and that was, somehow, more than hope had ever been. Reverend Hobart pronounced them married, and Jeremiah kissed his wife in the Cedar Bluff church, with Clara trying to see from between the adults and Henry watching with that quiet, slowly warming gaze. And the whole congregation made a noise that was part celebration and part relief. The relief of a small community watching one of its members come out of a dark place into light. After the wedding, Jeremiah moved into the homestead properly, which was an occasion that required some rearrangement of the small house's interior and a second shelf in the bedroom that he built himself one Saturday morning, while Abigail watched from the doorway with her coffee and offered opinions about its level that were entirely accurate. He brought his saddle and his tools and his books. He had 3 books, which Henry immediately borrowed, and Copper moved into the barn, and the barn's second stall, which had been empty and somewhat mournful, had a purpose again. The winter that year was not gentle. It was a West Texas winter, which meant 2 weeks of bitter cold in January that cracked the top of the well and tested every joint in the house, and required Jeremiah and Henry together to haul extra feed for the cattle through snow that was unusual for that region. But the roof held. The wheat they had planted in the fall would survive. The flour barrel was full, and the salt pork barrel was full, and there was coffee, and there were candles, and there were the 4 of them inside the house in the evenings with the wind working at the windows, and the lamp making a warm circle at the table where Henry was reading and Clara was drawing horses that looked increasingly like horses, and Abigail was mending by the stove. There was one evening in January, deep cold outside and the fire banked high, when all 4 of them were at the table after supper and Henry had gotten out his whittling, and the horse he was working on was clearly and unmistakably a horse now, the neck arched in the right line, and he set it on the table without saying anything, but Jeremiah picked it up and turned it over and said, "Henry, that is excellent." And Henry allowed himself a small private smile that said he had been working toward this for months. Abigail looked at Jeremiah over the table, and the look between them was quiet and full, and said something that did not need words, that this was the thing, this specific moment, this table with these 4 people and the fire and the winter outside, this was the thing they had both been moving toward without knowing the destination. Spring came. The wheat came up well. Jeremiah expanded the cattle herd by 4 animals, purchased with a portion of his savings and the proceeds from the fall wheat, and Henry worked beside him with the seriousness of a boy who understood that he was being taught things that mattered. Clara started school that spring and came home every afternoon with a new fact she had encountered, announced to the household with great urgency, and Abigail and Jeremiah exchanged glances over these announcements that were part amusement and part the deep, quiet satisfaction of parents watching a mind engage with the world. Abigail was expecting their child in the autumn. She told him on a Sunday morning in May, standing in the kitchen garden in the early sun, and she said it with a directness that was entirely hers, not a dramatic announcement, but a plain fact delivered to the person it most immediately concerned. "I believe we are going to have a baby in October or November," she said, and she was watching his face while she said it with the careful attention of someone who needed to see the response. What she saw was a man go very still, and then, with a slowness that was not restraint, but rather the careful handling of something he was almost afraid to damage with too sudden a grip, become the kind of joy that people do not often let themselves feel because it is too big and too vulnerable. He crossed the garden in 3 steps and put his arms around her and held her with a care that was also strength, and she put her forehead against his shoulder, and they stood there in the May morning with the whole day ahead of them. "I was thinking," she said after a moment, not moving away, "that if it is a boy we might call him Thomas, after his grandfather." She felt his arms tighten slightly. "And if it is a girl," she continued, "I thought Alina. It was my mother's name." "Thomas," Jeremiah said, and the word had a gentleness in it that was both grief and love and something that was bigger than either, the way that life sometimes encompasses the people who have gone before it in a way that is carrying rather than erasing. "Yes, I would be honored." She raised her head and looked at him. "He would have liked you," she said. "Thomas would have liked you." He looked at her very steadily. "I hope so," he said. "I intend to be worthy of it." She kissed him then, in the kitchen garden in the spring morning, her hands on his face, and the ring on her left hand that had been gone and come back and meant something now that it had always meant, and something new as well caught the light, and neither of them noticed. Harold Fenwick came for supper in June, riding out on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of wine from San Antonio, and the look of a man who is satisfied with how the world has arranged itself. He sat at the table that was becoming crowded in the very best way and ate Abigail's beans, and watched Jeremiah and Henry argue companionably about the correct way to train a working dog, and watched Clara show him her drawings with complete confidence that he would appreciate them properly. And afterward, when the children were in bed and the 3 adults sat on the porch in the warm night, he said to Jeremiah, "I am glad you came." "So am I," Jeremiah said. Fenwick looked at Abigail. "I hope it was not too impertinent, my letter, asking him to come." She considered him in the measured way that she considered everything, and then she said, "You returned my ring to me, Mr. Fenwick." "That was the beginning of everything. I will not be impertinent about the method." Fenwick nodded slowly and looked out at the dark land. "I have been in this business a long time," he said. "I have bought things from people at their worst moments, and I have sold things to people at their best moments, and I have sometimes confused the two. That ring was not mine to keep." "It was not," she agreed. "But you did the right thing." They were quiet together in the warm night, and the stars above Cedar Bluff were extraordinary, the way West Texas stars always were, and the land stretched out in the dark around the house that was no longer just surviving but genuinely living, and Fenwick said at last, "Thomas was a good man." "He was," Abigail said. "He would be pleased," Fenwick said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I believe he would be." Jeremiah reached over in the dark and took her hand, and she held his, and the evening moved on around them, comfortable and full. The baby came in November, the 3rd week, on a cold, clear night with the stars hard and bright outside the window, and the lamp turned high in the bedroom where the midwife, Mrs. Rawlings, had come to help. Henry sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours with his hands clasped, and his jaw set in exactly the way his mother set hers when something required endurance, and Clara fell asleep on the settee and had to be carried to bed. And when the sound came, the initial, furious announcement of new life arriving in the world, Henry straightened up, and his whole face changed from the careful, controlled look of a boy trying to be older than he was into the open, amazed face of a child hearing something miraculous. It was a boy, 8 pounds and certain about his own presence from the first moment. Jeremiah was allowed into the bedroom, and he sat beside his wife, who was exhausted and luminous in equal measure, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held his son for the first time, and the baby curled a hand around Jeremiah's finger with a grip that was absurdly strong and absolutely definitive. "Thomas," Jeremiah said. "Thomas James Wells," Abigail said. James had been Jeremiah's father's name, and she had told him she wanted to include it, which had undone him somewhat in the best way when she had said so 2 months before. "Welcome to this family, Thomas James." Henry came in and stood by the bed with his eyes very wide, and Clara appeared in the doorway where she had apparently woken herself with the determination that she was not missing this, and she looked at her new brother with the round-eyed gravity of a child confronting something enormous and real. "He is very small," Clara said. "You were very small once," Abigail said. "I do not remember that," Clara said, entirely reasonably. Henry sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in Jeremiah's arms with an expression that was the most open Jeremiah had ever seen on him, unguarded, wondering, something in it that was the beginning of the fierce protectiveness that would characterize him all his life. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. The baby looked up at the lamp with the unfocused gaze of the newly arrived and made a small sound. He said hello back, Clara said firmly. The year turned, and Cedar Bluff continued in the way that frontier towns continued through drought and plenty, through the slow creep of change that was bringing the railroad closer, and the cattle drives further from their old roots, through the ordinary and the extraordinary of human life being lived out against a backdrop of enormous country and enormous sky. The Slaterwells homestead, it went by both names for a long time, which was Abigail's preference, and Jeremiah had no argument with it, grew steadily. The wheat harvest in 1879 was the best the Northfield had produced, and by 1880 there were 12 cattle and a proper working dog named Fetch, who was Henry's achievement, and who did in fact fetch with a reliability that Henry considered only right. Clara's mind, which sprawled and connected and found patterns between things that did not obviously belong together, began to reveal itself as a particular kind of intelligence as she got older, and Abigail and Jeremiah began to think seriously about what education might be available to her beyond the Cedar Bluff schoolhouse. There were discussions in the evenings, long and engaged, about what the children would need and what might be possible, and these conversations had the quality of two people who were genuinely partners in a shared enterprise, disagreeing sometimes, convincing each other sometimes, always arriving at something that was better for having been thought through together. Henry, at 10, was quiet and capable and increasingly indispensable on the land, with a precision of observation about the animals and the crops that Jeremiah found genuinely impressive, and told him so without qualification. He was also, privately, a boy who was beginning to work out his own feelings about the father he had lost and the father he had found, and this was not a simple process, and Jeremiah did not pretend it should be. There was a Sunday afternoon when they were riding the fence line together in the fall, the two of them, and Henry said without preamble, "Do you think he would have been my friend if things were different?" Jeremiah considered Thomas Slater, known to him only through the stories Abigail had told, and the small material traces of a man who had loved this land, and loved his family with a practical, unshowy devotion. "I think you are exactly the kind of son he would have been proud of," he said carefully. "I think he would have taught you everything I am teaching you and a great deal that I cannot, because I did not know this particular land the way he did." Henry rode for a while in silence. "But do you think he would have liked me?" he said, and the nakedness of the question, a 10-year-old boy asking whether his dead father would have liked who he was growing into, was one of the most honest things Jeremiah had ever been asked. "Absolutely," Jeremiah said, "without question." Henry nodded once, absorbing this, filing it. And then he said, in the careful sideways way he had of saying things that mattered most, "I think you are a good father." Jeremiah kept his eyes on the fence line ahead. "Thank you, Henry," he said. "That means a great deal to me." They rode on, and the land was gold and enormous around them, and the sky was the particular flat blue of a West Texas autumn, and the fence was straight and true, and everything that needed saying had been said. Thomas Jr. grew into his name with a vigor that was somewhat overwhelming to everyone except Clara, who met it with a matching energy. He was a boy who ran everywhere and climbed everything, and had an opinion about most subjects by the age of 2.5, and Abigail watched him with a combination of exhausted love and a kind of private delight that was partly at the child himself, and partly at the way Jeremiah was with him, patient, engaged, delighted in a way that was entirely genuine and unperformed. There was a particular morning when little Thomas was 3, and had gotten out of bed at dawn and gone to the barn to help Jeremiah with the morning chores, which had led to a great deal of hay being distributed in locations that were not the feed trough. And Jeremiah had brought him back to the house holding the boy's hand, both of them with hay in their hair, and Abigail, standing at the stove, had looked at the two of them and felt something so full and so complete that it was almost painful in the way that very good things sometimes are, when you are aware of their value while you are inside them rather than only in retrospect. "He helped," Jeremiah said, straight-faced, nodding at his son. "I helped," Thomas confirmed with enormous certainty. "There is hay on the kitchen table," Abigail observed. "That was my fault," Jeremiah said. "That was his fault," Thomas said, pointing at Jeremiah. Abigail pressed her lips together against the laugh that was coming and said, "Both of you need to wash your hands." Jeremiah winked at her over the boy's head, and she looked away before the laugh escaped. And this small domestic comedy in the early morning kitchen of a homestead in Cedar Bluff, Texas, in the spring of 1882, was the life they had built, and it was good, and it was real, and it was exactly what both of them had found when neither had been entirely certain that finding was still possible. In the summer of 1882, they were sitting on the porch in the evening, Jeremiah and Abigail, in the two chairs that had always been the place where the important conversations happened, the comfortable conversations and the difficult ones, and the simply pleasant ones that were the texture of a shared life. The children were inside, Henry at his books, Clara at a letter she was writing to a girl she had met at a county gathering and declared her intellectual peer, Thomas theoretically asleep but probably not. The evening was warm and the cottonwoods were moving in a light wind, and the bluff to the north was turning its extraordinary colors in the last light, red and orange and a deep amber that was almost the color of the ring on Abigail's hand. "I was thinking about something," she said. "What is that?" "I was thinking about Fenwick's letter," she said. "The one you brought me. The one that said what he had done was a correction of a transaction that was not right." She was quiet a moment. "I read that letter many times. In the first weeks I read it almost every day." He looked at her. "I did not know that. She considered. I was trying to understand what it meant, that someone would do that, return something because they could not in good conscience keep it. I had not encountered very much of that by that point in my life." "Fenwick is an unusual man," Jeremiah said. "You are also an unusual man," she said. She turned to look at him. The last light was in her gray eyes, and she was 4 years older than the day he had first ridden up to her porch, and she was more beautiful to him now than she had been then, in the way that people become more beautiful when you know them fully, when the beauty is not separate from the knowledge but made of it. "You rode all the way from Amarillo to return a wedding ring to a woman you had never met," she said, "on your great-uncle's word." "He is a trustworthy man," Jeremiah said. It was still an unusual thing to do. "I suppose it was," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. "I want you to know," she said, and her voice was steady and direct and full, entirely her, "that I am grateful for it every day. Not because of the ring, though I am grateful for the ring too, because without it," she stopped and looked out at the bluff. "Without it, you would not have come, and that is not a thing I can imagine now. I have tried, in the way that you sometimes test your gratitude by imagining its absence. I cannot imagine now the life that did not include you." He turned his hand under hers and held it. "Neither can I," he said. "Thomas's ring started all of this," she said. "Thomas himself, in a way. He earned this ring and he gave it to me, and I sold it because that is the world we were living in, and a kind old man sent it back to me with a stranger who became—" She looked at him, and her voice shifted into something that was entirely unguarded and entire. "Who became my person. Who became the safest place I know." He brought her hand up to his lips, the way he had done the first time she agreed to marry him, and she felt the ring against his cheek, her husband's ring and then hers alone and then hers with him, and the evening moved around them, warm and full of the sounds of summer and life. "I love you," she said quietly to the man beside her. "I love you," he said, and the simplicity of it was the truest thing he knew. Behind them, through the screen door, They could hear Thomas Jr.'s voice declaring with great authority to apparently no one that he was not asleep, and Clara's murmured reply, and the sound of a page turning in Henry's book, and the small complex music of a family settled into its life, whole and present and entirely itself. The ring on Abigail's hand caught the last light of the evening sun, worn smooth on the inside from the years of wearing, and then the sun went down behind the bluff, and the stars came out over Cedar Bluff, Texas, each one steady and burning in its place, and the porch held the two of them in the warm dark, and the house behind them held everything they had built and everything they had been given and everything they had found, and there was nothing left open or unresolved or waiting. There was only this: the life fully arrived, the love fully given, and the deep and complete peace of a story that had found its true end.